Tonight's Sugya Shiur, the origins of prayer, patriarchs or sacrifices. That's the title of the shiur. It's in honor of Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau's visit to the BAYT this past Shabbos. And the reason why I mention that is because those of you who were here for his drasha, he spoke about this very Gemara that we're going to begin with tonight, about what is the origin of davening 3 times a day, Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. What's interesting is that as Rav Lau was speaking on Shabbos morning, I smiled because he had given me before Shabbos a volume of his sefer called Yachel Yisrael, which is a 3-volume series on, scholarly, shilas and shuvas, essays on, shas sugyas, like Sugya Shiurs, right? And the 3rd volume has a mimer, has an essay on this very topic. And so as he was speaking, I was remembering what I had just happened to flip through the sefer and come upon that particular essay, and he decided to cite that very Gemara. So that's why I decided that we would choose this discussion for this evening. I want to go through the Gemara and then ask a series of questions on the Gemara, and then hopefully try to unpack a number of difficult issues revolving around this sugya. It's a Gemara in Brachos Daf Chavav Amid Beis, which brings a machlokus as to what the origin of davening 3 times a day. Itmar, Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina Omar Tfilos Avos Tiknum, that our prayers were instituted by our patriarchs. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Omar Tfilos Keneged Tamidim Tiknum. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi disagrees, and he says that our prayers were instituted to correspond to the daily korbanos. Tanya Kavase, the Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, the Tanya Kavase, the Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. We now have brises to support both opinions. Tanya Kavase, the Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, Avram Tikein Tefillah Shacharis. The brisa says that Avram instituted Shacharis. Shenamar, Vayashkem Avraham Baboker El Hamakom Asher Omad Sham. That Avram woke up early in the morning. This is for the Akedah. It's actually even before the Akedah. It's by the story of Sodom. And ve'ein amida ela tefillah. And the word amida means prayer. So he woke up early to pray. Shenamar vayavmod Pinchas vayifalel. Vayavmod Pinchas vayifalel, as Pinchas arose and prayed. So that's number 1. We know that Avraham instituted, or he is the exemplar for Tefillah Shacharis. Yitzchak tikein Tefillas Mincha. Yitzchak instituted the prayer of Mincha. Shenamar vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh lifnos arev, as it says that Yitzchak went out to speak in the field towards evening. Ve'ein sicha ela tefillah, that sicha refers to prayer. Shenamar tefillah la'ani ki yatov lifnei Hashem yishpoch sicha, as the pasuk says, a prayer for the poor man when he wraps himself, and before God he will pour out his conversation. So that's the association between tefillah and sicha. And finally, Yaakov tikein tefillas arvis. Yaakov instituted the Ma'ariv prayer. Shenamar vayifga b'makom vayolen sham. This is the famous passage about Yaakov Avinu in Parshas Vayetze, that he arrives at the place and he lodged there. Ve'ein pigia ela tefillah. The reaching of the place is reference to prayer. Shenamar ve'atal tisplel ba'ad ha'am hazeh. Ve'al tisa ba'adam rina utfila ve'al tifga bi. That God says, do not be pogeya me, which means don't pray to me, leave me alone. So you see that pigia means prayer. These are the psukim, says the Gemara, that tell us that Avram instituted Shacharis, Yitzchak instituted Mincha, and Yaakov instituted Ma'ariv. So far, so good. This is a very well-known Gemara. Most of us are familiar with this Gemara. Now we have a brisa to support Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who says that it corresponds to the daily sacrifices. Why? Because the brisa says, the brisa says, why is a person allowed to daven shacharis until midday? Because the morning tamid sacrifice can be brought until chatzos, and therefore you see a direct correspondence between shacharis and the morning sacrifice. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, ad arba shos. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you only have the first 4 hours. Shari tamid shel shachar kari b'holech ad arba shos. But Rabbi Yehuda's reason for disagreeing also has to do with the karbanos, that you only have the first 4 hours of the morning to bring the daily tamid, and therefore you only have the first 4 hours of the morning to daven shacharis. Then the Brisa continues, why did they say that you can only daven mincha until nightfall? Because the afternoon korban tamid can only be brought until the evening. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer at plag hamincha. Rabbi Yehuda says that no, you can only daven mincha until plag hamincha, which is a period which we won't analyze what the period of plag is, but it's 10 3/4 hours into the day, of course. And the reason is because that's for Rabbi Yehuda, that's his shita as for the last time that you can bring the tamid shel bein harabayim. Why didn't going to Ma'ariv did the rabbi say that you can daven at any time at night? In other words, there's no time limit as long as it's dark. As it says, that the limbs and other remnant animal parts that are burning on the altar continue burning throughout the night. And Ma'ariv therefore corresponds to the Eivarim U'Pedarim that are burning the fats and the intestines that are burning on the altar. Then the Brisa continues and it says, why do we daven musaf for the entire day? You can daven musaf any time during the day. There's no time limit as long as it's daytime hours. You can daven musaf. Where do we get that from? Shaharei karban shel musafim karev kol hayom. Because you can bring the korban musaf of Shabbos and of Yom Tov the entire day. And Rabbi Yehuda Omer ad sheva shos shaharei korban musaf karev v'holech ad sheva shos. And Rabbi Yehuda says you can only offer it until hour number 7, because that's the time when you're allowed to bring the korban musaf. Okay, those are the two brises. Then the Gemara goes into a discussion of defining plag hamincha and discussing the time of the 7th hour of korban musaf. But then the Gemara asks a question. So we're skipping a few lines in the Gemara. But the Gemara now asks, Nema tihavi tiyufte de Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina. Let us suggest that the Brisa, which discusses the whole idea of the corresponding tfilos of Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv, and Musaf, to correspond to the karbanos that were offered in the Beis HaMikdash, let us suggest that this brisa is a tiyufta, is a challenge to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Now, at face value, this question in and of itself is quite bizarre, because after all, we just cited a brisa that supports Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Why, just because we have another brisa that supports Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, why is that a tiyufta to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina? Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina has his brisa, and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi has his brisa. So why would we think that one brisa is a challenge to one amora more than the other brisa is a challenge to the other amora? So keep that question in mind. But the Gemara suggests that this whole discussion of karbanos corresponding to tfilos is a tiyufta to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. So Amr Lacha, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, no. La'olam ema lacha tfilos avos tiknum. Really, I admit that the patriarchs instituted the 3 prayers, ve'asmechinhu rabbanan ha-karbanos. But the rabbanan came along, and they also corresponded it further to the karbanos. In other words, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina admits that there is a correlation between davening and karbanos. He's not saying that the exclusive reason why we daven Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv is for the avos. He's saying that there are both reasons that are true. He says, De'ilote mahachi, if you don't submit to that, Tfilas Musaf l'Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina mantikna. Then what's Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina going to do with Musaf? He says, if the 3 avos instituted Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv, then where do we get Musaf from? You have to submit that Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina agrees that there is a correlation between the prayers and the karbanos. It's just that he goes back even further historically and says that there's an additional connection which has to do with the patriarchs. Ela tfilos avos tiknum v'asmechinhu rabbanan ha-karbanos. And rather what you have to say is that the patriarchs instituted the 3 prayers of Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv, and the Chachamim additionally attached them or correlated those prayers, including Musaf, to the offering of the karbanos and confined the specific times of those davenings based upon the time limitations of the Karbanos. That seems to be the flow of the Gemara. And Rashi says, as Rashi explains, Ela al karchach rabbanan asmechinu akarbanos v'chi'inu v'musafin v'lo matzu tefila kenegda amdu heng v'tiknuha. That the Rabbanan basically, it seems like from Rashi, that the way that Rashi's learning the Gemara is, the Chachamim saw that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov instituted Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv, but those original institutions did not involve time limitations in the same way that we have time limitations today that are based upon the Karbanos. The Chachamim came and instituted those time limitations of Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv to correlate and correspond to the Karbanos. And since they're correlating Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv to the Karbanos, they also took into account Musaf, instituted that as well to correspond to the Karban Musaf on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. I hope that's clear. That should be, that's sort of like the foundation of our discussion for this evening. Okay? Now that we have that in place, I want to ask you a series of 4 questions. Some of these you'll be able to figure out on your own, and some we're going to go through some of the sources together. First of all, why does the Gemara only ask a tiyufta on Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina from the Brisa having to do with the Karbanos corresponding to, the Tfilos corresponding to Karbanos? Why doesn't the Gemara ask a corresponding question on Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and say, look, he just observes that the Tfilos correspond to Karbanos, but what does he do with the Brisa that says that the Avos instituted the Tfilos? What does Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi do with that? The Gemara doesn't seem to be bothered by that. And for good reason, as I mentioned, because once you have a Brisa to support your position, it's not a tiyufta on you from another Brisa. Okay? Let me ask another question. We know from Parshas Chaye Sarah, the very famous Rashi on the pasuk Ekev, that God says to Yitzchak, Ekev asher shama Avraham b'koli vayishmor mishmarti mitzvosai chukosai v'sorosai, that God tells to Yitzchak, walk with me, I will be with you, I have a covenant special relationship with you, because Avraham observed all of my commandments. Vayishmor mishmarti mitzvosai chukosai v'sorosai, and he observed every single commandment of mine, even the ones that I hadn't yet commanded. Now it seems from the Gemara that Avraham Avinu only davened Shacharis, and it was only Yitzchak who came along and instituted Mincha. So the question that I ask you, we know that that Avraham Avinu had a Pesach Seder, he ate matzahs, we know all of those things. Did Avraham daven Mincha? Did he daven Ma'ariv? Or did he have to wait for Yitzchak to come along and to daven Mincha? It seems from the Gemara that you're a little bit out of a stira, because if Avraham observed all the mitzvahs, and as we'll see the Gemara in Yoma, which is the source for this, then how can you tell me that Avraham was the only instituted Shacharis and did not daven Mincha until Yitzchak came along and daven Mincha? What?
Is it a Rabbanan D'Oraisa? So maybe Avraham just...
Well, as you'll see, that Avraham even kept the D'Rabbanans.
They weren't invented yet. Okay, fine, but they weren't invented yet.
Okay, fine, but neither were any of the mitzvahs.
Yeah, but the rest of them, okay. Our big Rishut.
What's that?
Our big is Rishut, according to some.
Okay, that's going to be another question. The next question, like Rabbi Berman asks, there's an opinion in the Gemara that says that Tfilas Ma'ariv is a Rishus. It's not obligatory. So the question then is, so what, Yaakov's chopped liver? If the Tfilos Avos Tiknum, if the 3 prayers were instituted by Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, then Yaakov Avinu instituted Ma'ariv. So why should the Gemara say that Ma'ariv is of a lesser standing? It only makes sense if you learn like the opinion like Rabbi Shua ben Levi, that it corresponds to the Karbanos. But if the Tfilos correspond to the Avos, then why should Ma'ariv have a lower standing as far as its level of obligation than Shacharis and Mincha? Now let's clarify that today, Ma'ariv is an obligatory prayer just like Shacharis and Mincha. However, that was an evolutionary process. Originally, Ma'ariv was a voluntary prayer, and then Klal Yisrael accepted it upon itself as obligatory. But if it was originated by Yaakov Avinu, then why should it be of any lesser standing than Shacharis and Mincha? And then finally, let's ask one more question. In general, we say that we don't learn halachic practice from the Avos. So for example, when it comes to the mitzvah of bris milah, it's necessary for the Torah to give us the mitzvah of bris milah after Matan Torah. It's not just enough to say that we learn the mitzvah of bris milah from Avraham Avinu. The Torah has to say it explicitly in Parshas Tazria, Uvayom Hashmini Yimol B'sar Orloso, in order for Klal Yisrael to know that that mitzvah is Lidoros, that it is a permanent mitzvah. And that's why even, let's say, for example, in Parshas Vayishlach, it says, Al Kain Lo Yochlu B'nei Yisrael Es Gid Anoshe. There's a specific statement in the Torah written after the story that tells us that this is the reason why B'nei Yisrael may not eat the Gid Hanoshe, but it's a commandment. It's in the form of a commandment. So you see that after the Torah is given, we need to have these mitzvahs commanded to us. So just because Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov instituted these prayers is not sufficient of a reason for us to have to feel obligated to daven Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv unless we were commanded to. And a corollary of that question is the following question. Does Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina maintain that there is a biblical obligation to daven Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv? Is that what he is suggesting? Because if, after all, it comes from Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, so then it would stand to reason that there is a biblical obligation to daven Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. It's one thing to say that the Chachamim positioned it to correspond the limitations of time, perhaps. But is davening 3 times a day a deoraisa? There's no one who holds that among the Rishonim. The Rambam holds, as we'll see, that tefillah on a daily basis is a deoraisa. But to daven 3 times a day, like Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, there doesn't seem to be anyone that holds it that it's a deoraisa. So, with all of this in mind, let's go through some of the traditional Mikoros and see what we can come out with. Now, I'm indebted to Rabbi Lau for providing many of these Meira Mekomos in his essay. I have to give disclosure that in his essay he takes it in a different direction, a direction which I'm not sure that I find to be that appealing because he tries to go through a bit of a pill pull that I think that I would probably, if we had more time, I could present it to you and say with some of the issues, perhaps an area of disagreement that I might have respectfully. But I think that there's a tremendous value looking at these Makoros unto themselves and coming up with some of the conclusions that Rabbi Lau presents us with at the beginning part of his essay. So first of all, let's take a look at the Slach, Rabbi Cheskel Landau, the Noda Yehuda. In his commentary to Maseches Brachos, he states as follows. Tanya Kava, that's source number 2, Tanya Kavase de Rabbi Yossi be Rabbi Chanina Avraham Tikein B'chule. That we have a brayta to support Rabbi Yossi be Rabbi Chanina, that Avraham instituted Shacharis, Yitzchak instituted Mincha, and Yaakov instituted Ma'ariv. So the Gemara now says, Hinelo ka'amar hashas kan al brayta zu nema tihavi tiyufta de Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Curiously, says Ritzlach, the Gemara does not say this poses a problem to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. As Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi says, it was only instituted by Chazal to correspond to Karbanos. Why not? Kidomer lekamen v'idach brais the Tanya Kavase the Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi the Omer Nema Tihavi Tiyuf to the Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. So why is that? Why is there not a parallel to Yufta on Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi from Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina's braysa, just like there's a tiyufta on Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi's braysa? And the answer that the Gemara says is v'nireh. And it would seem, says the Gemara, Mishum. Now, by the way, you could answer this question by saying that the question on Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina is based upon the very strict limitations of time that are contained in the braysa that is cited to support Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. You don't see any strict limitations of time that are contained in Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina's braysa, and that could be the reason why it's not presented as a challenge to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. That's the way that I had originally presented it to you to make the Gemara understandable, but that's not the way that Tzlach understands the ebb and flow of the Gemara, the Shakel of Itaria. So he says as follows. He says, "V'nira mishum de Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi sof hatanoim haya, v'lo shayach lameimer alav tiyufta mibraisa di'ihutana upolig." So first answer he gives is that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is a big kahuna, right? He's a big guy. He's close to the Tanoim. He's at the end of the era of the Tanoim. He is, after all, a disciple of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And therefore, you can't bring a brisa to challenge him, because he could always say that I have the authority of a Tana, and I don't have to submit to that brisa. That's one answer. Va'od, he says, Niralanios Daiti, de brisa zu lo amru beferish sha'avos tiknu tfilos halalu chovel adoros, rak amru shehema tiknu shalosh tfilos halalu. The other answer, which is quite important, says Vitzlach, is that the brisa of Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina never states explicitly that Avram Yitzchak and Yaakov instituted Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv as permanent institutions for the Jewish people. It just says that they davened Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. That for themselves, they instituted Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. Avram davened Shacharis, Yitzchak davened Mincha, Yaakov davened Ma'ariv. However, v'ulai la'atzmam tiknu v'lo l'doros. And so therefore, from that brisa, you don't really see how this became a permanent institution for the Jewish people. So, v'anshe knesses hagdola shetiknu l'doros neged tamidin tiknu v'leket tiyufta Rav Yeshua ben Levi. And therefore, even according to this brisa of Rav Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina, you have to submit that the rabbis were the ones who instituted the prayers. They looked back, perhaps, at the patterns that had been set by Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and they based it on their prayers, but not that that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov instituted this for future generations. So therefore, it's really not a challenge to Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, who says that it was instituted by the sages. He says, yeah, even according to that brisa, it was instituted by the sages. They corresponded it to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and to the Karbanos. And now we can understand why the Gemara only asks the tiyufta and Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina v'lichara kasha ech shaykh tiyufta keven dika brayse the Messiah le ulefi ma shekasafti nicha da'ach brayse ena Messiah le lechalutin. Now we can understand why the Gemara only asks the kasha on Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina. What kind of tiyufta is in Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina if he has a brayse to support him? The answer is the brayse doesn't really support him, because Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina is making an assertion that is not explicitly stated by the brayse. The brayse never states explicitly that the Avos instituted these prayers for all future generations, like Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina says. And so that's why the Gemara says it really is a tiyufta and Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina. So you see, at least from the understanding of Vitzlach, that when he looks at this Gemara, which says that Avos, Tfilos Avos Tiknum, that the prayers were instituted by our patriarchs, it's mamish that Avram Avinu got up with his Beis Din, and he paskined the halacha for all future doiros, that everyone, Rabbi Say, everyone of my future generations, that the daven shachars. Comes along Yitzchak and he brings his Beis Din together and he says, I'm paskening a halacha for all future generations. We have to all daven mincha. Yaakov does the same. So comes along the Gemara and suggests that this is a brisa to support him, even though the brisa never really says what Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina says, because the brisa never says that it was instituted for all future generations, and that's why the Gemara says it's a tiyufta. And the Gemara's conclusion really is, you're right, that even Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina agrees that Avram's Beis Din didn't institute this for future generations, nor did Yitzchak, nor did Yaakov, but rather the Chachamim noted that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov had paskined to daven, right? And the Rabbanan came along and va'asmechuhu Rabbanan. So there are a number of ways that you can learn va'asmechuhu Rabbanan or Karbanos. Is it that the Gemara is rejecting that? Is it that the Gemara is now saying, you're right, it's not that they really got their batei din together and paskin this, but really they just set a pattern for themselves, and therefore Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Chanina is really acknowledging that it's the D'Rabbanan. That seems to be the way that Tzlach is learning. Now the truth of the matter is that this would solve a lot of problems if you learn the Gemara that way. And the truth is that that's explicit in the Yerushalmi. You see, if you just look in the Yerushalmi, you see a language right away which indicates to us that no one really entertains the possibility that the Avos instituted these prayers for future generations. If you take a look in source number 10 on page 4.
Did you say that with me also?
Well, what we say by Mila is that God gave the mitzvah to Avraham, but the mitzvah that is binding on Klal Yisrael is because it's written in the Torah in Parshas Tazria. Now, so take a look at the Yerushalmi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Now, who was Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi in our Gemara? Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi in the Gemara, in the Bavli, says that the tefillos correspond to karbanos, not to the avos. Comes along Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi in the Yerushalmi and says, tefillos me avos limedum, that the tefillos are learned from the patriarchs. It's a very different language. It's not that the avos instituted those prayers, but that the rabbis learned the prayer of Shacharis from Avraham. And that seems to be the maskana of the Gemara, both for Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi in the Bavli. In other words, really these brises are not at odds with each other. Of course, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov historically davened these prayers. However, that's not the reason why you and I daven Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv today. The Rabbanan instituted Shacharis, Mincha, and Ma'ariv based upon a tradition that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov davened those prayers, so they set a pattern for us for future generations. And the rabbis also corresponded those prayers and their halachic limitations to the way that we used to offer the karbanos in the Beis HaMikdash. And therefore, the whole thing works out well. And the Gemara goes through basically in the Yerushalmi the same kind of language. Now, if you take a look at the Maritz Chiyas, he sees that in the language itself of our Gemara, in source number 9. The Maritz Chiyas says, and that's I'm sorry for the difficult script, I don't have it on the Bar Ilan CD, at least not that I can find it. Reb Tzvi Chiyas says, the Tfilos Avos Tiknum, he says, Nichtav B'tzad Hinei HaRambam Periktes Mehilchos Melachim. So, before we get into the Maritz Chiyas, let's go through two pieces of Rambam to at least understand the background information. So we're going to go to sources number 7 and number 8. Source number 7 is the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim, where he discusses the history of how monotheism spread within mankind. And he says in the ninth chapter, in the first paragraph of the 9th chapter of Hilchos Melachim, and he talks about the Shiva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, he tells us an interesting historical fact. He tells us that Al Shisha Dvarim Nistava Adam Harisha, that Adam was given 6 commandments when he was first created and placed in the garden. Al Avodah Zarah, Al Birkas Hashem, Al Shvichus Damim, Ve'al Gili Arayas, Ve'al Hagezel, Ve'al Hadinim. That God told him, you can't worship idols, you can't curse God, you can't murder, you cannot commit acts that are licentious, you cannot steal, and you have to set up a court system, a judiciary. Afal Pishakulan Hen Kabbalah B'Yodenu Mimoshe Rabbeinu V'Hadas Nota Lahen Michlal Divrei Torah Yireh Sha'al Elu Nitztaveh, or Yera'eh Sha'al Elu Nitztaveh. So we know that these are traditions, but it would seem that we can derive from words of Torah that Adam Harishon was commanded with these 6 commandments. Hosif L'Noach Ever Min HaChai. God added a 7th commandment to Noach, and that's why these are known as the Shiva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. And he told him the 7th commandment of Ever Min HaChai, of not eating from a live animal, Shenemar Ach Basar B'Nafsho Dam Lo Sochelu. That God told Noach that you may not eat a living creature while it still has its soul in it. So Nimtzu Sheva Mitzvahs. So we find that these are the 7 Noachide laws. V'chein haya hadavar b'chol ha'olam ad Avraham. And this was the way things were until Avraham Avinu. Ba Avraham v'nitztava yeser alelu b'mila. Avraham was given an additional commandment. He was given the mitzvah of bris milah. V'hu hispalel shacharis. And he also was the originator of the morning prayer. V'yitzchak hifrish meiser v'hosef tefillah acheres lifnos hayom. Yitzchak did an additional mitzvah, which was to tithe his produce, tithe his assets, and he also instituted the prayer of mincha. The Yaakov Hosef gid hanosha v'yispalel arvis, and Yaakov Avinu added his mitzvah, plus Tfilas Ma'ariv. Now this is a fascinating Rambam, because basically what the Rambam is telling us is not only is there an evolution of the patriarchs from one generation to the next, but it seems like each succeeding generation, for the Rambam it's important to do this, each succeeding generation is given a special mitzvah. Avram has his special mitzvah, Yitzchak has his special mitzvah, Yaakov has his special mitzvah, and Avram has his special tefillah, Yitzchak and Yaakov, each one has their special tefillah. He puts them in hand. We make an amazing analysis as to what the connection between the mitzvah is to Abraham and to his tefillah, to Yitzchak and his tefillah, and Yaakov and his tefillah. Why these three mitzvahs? Bris Milah, Meiser, and Gid Hanasha. Okay? We will leave that on the side for now. Okay? And Mitzrayim, Nitztava Amram, the mitzvahs Yiseros. Amram, who was the leader of the Jewish people while the Jews were still in Egypt, was commanded additional commandments. Ad Shava Moshe Rabbeinu v'nishlama Torah al yado, until Moshe Rabbeinu came along and the Torah, whatever had not yet been given, was supplemented by Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's not that Moshe Rabbeinu was given a brand new 613 mitzvahs. There were 7 that were given to the older world, another 3 that were given to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and a whole bunch of others that were given to Amram. So by the time it came to Moshe Rabbeinu, there could have been less than 600 that were given to Moshe, in addition to what had already been known to Klal Yisrael. Now, of course, all 613 had to be recommanded to Bnei Yisrael at Har Sinai, as I mentioned. Now let's take a look at another Rambam. This Rambam is in Hilchos Tefillah. And the Rambam says in Hilchos Tefillah, in source number 8, in the first chapter, Halacha Aleph, he writes, Mitzvah saseh lihispalul b'chol yom shenemar va'abadetem es Hashem Elokecha. It is a positive commandment to daven every day. There is a biblical commandment to daven on a daily basis. Comes along the Rambam then in Halacha Hey of that same chapter, and he says, V'chein tiknu sheyehi minyan hatfilos k'minyan hakarbanos. He says that's the biblical obligation, but the rabbinic obligation, the rabbis instituted a rule about prayer that the tfilos should correspond to the karbanos. Shtei tfilos b'chol yom keneged shnei tamidim, that the shachars and mincha to correspond to the morning tamid and the afternoon tamid. B'chol yom sheyesh karban musaf tiknu bo tfilah shlishis keneged karban musaf. And on Shabbos and Yom Tov, when there's an additional karban, you have an additional prayer called Tfilas Musaf. Utfilah shehi keneged tamid shel boker yinikres tfilah shachar, tfilah sheneged tamid shebin harbaim yinikres tfilas mincha, utfilah sheneged hamusafim yinikres tfilas hamusafim. And then later the Rambam says that they also added ma'ariv to correspond to the burning of the fats and the intestines on the altar. So comes along the Maritz Chiyas and he says, I see a steer in the Rambam. In Hilchos Melachim, the Rambam says that the tfilos were instituted by Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, like Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. And in Hilchos Tfilah, the Rambam seems to be paskening like Rabbi Shiur ben Levi, that the tfilos correspond to karbanos. That's the Maritz Chiyas' question. He says, Hine harambam perach tes mehilchos melachim halacha aleph kosav gamkein. Avraham tikein tefillah shachris Yitzchak mincha Yaakov arvis. Ve'ulam perach aleph mehilchos tefillah halacha hey. Pasa kimanda omer tfilos keneged tmidim tiknu. So how do you reconcile that stira? Is it like Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, or is it like Rabbi Shiur ben Levi? That's the question of the Maritz Chiyas. So v'ha'emesu debazeh leka shum cholek. He says, in reality, there's no one who argues with the following. He says, deha'avos tiknu hatfilos. Everyone agrees that Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were the first ones to daven Shachris Mincha and Ma'ariv. V'sham behilchos melachim demedaber Rabbeinu min seder his pashtus mitzvos Hashem ad sheva Moshe Rabbeinu nakat ha'inyan kefi ma shahaya. The Rambam in Hilchos Melachim has a task. His task is to explain to us historically how mitzvos began to be practiced even before the Torah was given. He tells us that the first 6 were given to Adam, then the 7th was given to Noah, and then an 8th to Avraham, and that was practiced by Avraham, a 9th by Yitzchak, a 10th by Yaakov, several more by Amram until the Torah is given by Moshe Rabbeinu. He's telling us how a historical evolution of mitzvah practice accumulates over the generations starting from Adam Harishon. Ulam b'meshu chova aleinu, but how these mitzvahs that were performed pre-Matan Torah are obligatory upon you and me, hine klal gadol etzleinu ein lemeidim davar hakodim Matan Torah. We have a general principle that you cannot take practices that were done before the Torah was given and say that that's obligatory upon us without knowing that they were given at Har Sinai. Ba'ayin Rambam Perish HaMishnah Sof Perak Yid Hanoshe u'Mishnah Lamelech Perak Yud Mehilchos Melachim Halacha Zayin, and therefore V'im Kain. And therefore, based on this, Nihida Avos Tiknu, I will grant you that the Avos were the first ones to daven these prayers, and they instituted these prayers, Mikol Makom, Ein takanasam lachov aleinu. Their institution cannot obligate you and me to daven 3 times a day. Umipnei zet tzarich lomar da'anshe knesses hagdola tiknu neged tamidim v'rak mishum takanasam anu mitzuvim lehisnaheg kain. That therefore, even according to Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbi Chanina, you have to submit that the Anshe Knesses Hagdola instituted these 3 prayer services, and they made them to correspond to the sacrificial order, and that's why you and I daven. Shachris Mincha Marav. You and I daven in a way that corresponds to the Karbanos. We hearken back to the prayers of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but you and I don't daven because they davened. We daven because the Anshe Knesses Hagdola took into consideration the pattern that they set for us, and they further patterned it after the Karbanos.
That's obvious, because Korbanos came first, really, because that's what's in the Torah. We only after we lost the Beit HaMikdash did we start to daven. Did they take it?
No. Prayer is part of the Torah also. According to the Rambam, there's a biblical obligation to pray. Va'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem means that you shall serve the Lord your God with prayer, according to the Rambam. So that mitzvah of prayer is extant even during the period of Karbanos. Right. Yes.
Would the Noach doing a korban be significant, or we don't consider that?
It is significant that Karbanos existed before the giving of the Torah, but that cannot be the pattern of how we daven, because the only time that we were given a specific pattern of offering Karbanos on a daily basis was after the Torah was given. Okay?
The Lashon of the Rambam is very clear, though. He doesn't use the word Tikkun. He uses Hosif or Hillel. He's very careful not
exactly.
to
And
use
that's
language.
The Marzchias. Therefore, you could say it's obvious, it's Pashut, right? If you looked carefully in the language of the Rambam, I agree.
I think it's more than that. The Rambam is, as you said, he's giving historical analysis, and he's very careful. He doesn't use the language of the Gemara.
Yeah.
And none of these specifically use language of the Gemara that say that the
right.
Tikkun.
Right, but the Marzchias is reading the Rambam into the Gemara.
Yeah.
He's saying this is the Rambam's reading of the Gemara, and he's saying actually that that's the conclusion of the Gemara. He says, and these are the last 2 lines of the Marzchias, he says, V'chein mashma lashon hashas, kan tfilos avos tiknu v'asmechina rabbanon al karbanos. He says that when the Gemara explains Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina's Shita, he says, yes, it's true. He bases it on the fact that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov daven Shachris Mincha Ma'ariv, but that the Rabbanan attached it to the Karbanos. He says, what does that mean? Hainu dezos bevadei barur de'avos tiknu, rak Rabbanan de'asochov aleinu hu dumya de Karbanos, v'nachon. He says, of course, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov daven min Shachris Mincha Ma'ariv, but the rabbis instituted it, not Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. It has to be that way because there's no posek who holds that Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv are a biblical obligation. And it's the rabbis who instituted this based upon the patterns that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov had set. And when they instituted it, they made the tefillos constrained by the way that we offer karbanos. And so, for example, you can only offer the korban tamid until chatzos hayom, and therefore you can only daven shachris until midday. Even though perhaps when Avram davened, he might have davened a shtickle after chatzos, or according to Rebbe Yehuda, he might have davened a shtickle, right? If he found a shtivel nearby, he would have davened a little bit after the 4th hour of the day. Nevertheless, you and I are constrained by the way that karbanos are brought in the Beis HaMikdash. right? And the same thing, Yitzchak might not have felt the same constraints of the way that Chazal instituted the Karbanos, but yet we see patterns of the way that they davened. Now, yeah.
If according to the Rambam, each Rabbi had a specific mitzvah that correlated to the davening, how did that come back to the Karbanos then?
It doesn't. Right, that's an independent discussion.
Then why would you have to bring that?
The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah are not looking at those mitzvahs that are attached to Shachris Mincha and Ma'ariv. The Rambam creates that attachment. I don't know what the Rambam's source for creating the correlation that he does, that Bris Milah is attached to Shachris, and Meiser is attached to Mincha, and Gid Anosha is attached to Ma'ariv. I mean, I can give a beautiful drush. If you give me 5 minutes, I'll come up with something great. But the point is, what I'm trying to say is that that's not part of our discussion now. The Anshe Knesset Hagdolah come along generations later, and they institute an obligation for you and me to daven Shachris Mincha and Ma'ariv completely independent of the Rambam's consideration of the correlation to their respective mitzvahs. Okay?
Isn't the fourth Moshe who said Neshama Parim Moshe said Neshama Parim
Neshama Parim Sifasenu.
That's even before.
Right.
Anshe Knesset.
That is before Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, but the question is that an asmachta or not? Is Hosea telling us that as and even if it's not an asmachta, because it's not a d'oraisa din, it's a pasuk from a navi. The navi's basically saying that in the absence of karbanos, you can use your mouth for prayer. That doesn't necessarily mean that the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah formally instituted an obligation of tefillah to correspond to the karbanos. Okay, now just to go back to the other question of how do we reconcile the fact that if Avram observed all of the Torah, then he only davened Shachris. So this question is really based on the Gemara in Yoma. I've sort of foreshadowed it. Let's go back to source number 3. Omar Rav, Kiyem Avram Avinu Kol HaTorah Kula. The Gemara says that Avram fulfilled the entire Torah. Shenemar Eikev Asher Shona Avraham B'Koli Vayishmor Mishmarti Mitzvosaychu Kosai V'Sorosai. That's what the pasuk says that God says to Yitzchak. Avram did everything. So Amar Lei Rav Shimi Bar Chila Rav Ve'emasha V'Mitzvos. Maybe Avram only observed the 7 Noachide laws. Maybe that's what God was saying to Yitzchak. Answers Ha'ikanami Mila. But we know that Avram did more than just the Sheva Mitzvahs because he had a bris. So the Gemara says Ve'ema Sheva Mitzvahs V'Mila. So maybe there was only 8 mitzvahs that Avram did. So Amar Lei Imkein Mitzvosai V'Sorosai Lamali. So why does the Torah have to use so many words to describe God's commandments? He should have just said Eikav Asher Shema Avraham B'Koli Vayishmor Mishmarti. Period. Avram listened to me and he observed my ordinances. But what about mitzvosai and sorosai? What is that supposed to teach me? So, therefore, Omar Rava v'itema Rav Ashi, Kiyem Avram Avinu afilu eruve tavshilin, shenemar torosai, echas Torah shebichsa ve'echas Torah sheba'al peh. That Avram fulfilled all of the commandments, even the mitzvah of eruv tavshilin, to include both the written tradition and the oral tradition. Now, eruv tavshilin is even more just than the oral tradition. It's a rabbinic law, Archie. So you see that the Gemara is even saying that Avraham Avinu observed rabbinic law. So it's oral law, it's written, it's Torah Shebichsav, Torah Sheba'al Peh, and included in Torah Sheba'al Peh is even rabbinic law. So the question then is, Avraham Avinu was a gans from a Yid, so wouldn't daven Mincha? How come he has to wait for Yitzchak and to daven Mincha and for Yaakov to daven Ma'ariv? So this is a question that some of the Meforshim ask. And the Maharsha says in Maseches Brachos, citing that Gemara in Yoma, he says, "V'nira o devadei Avram nami haya mispalo mincha ve'arvis." Avram also daven mincha and ma'ariv. The Amrina and the Yoma, da'afilu erev tavshilin kiyeh. Avram even fulfilled the mitzvah of erev tavshilin, which is purely rabbinic in nature. So surely he must have davened mincha and ma'ariv. So Elamai, Ela demikol echad me'ha'avos lamadin lufi masha matzina bo shehispalel. All the Gemara is saying in Brachos is that each one of the avos davened a specific kind of prayer. And we're just demonstrating from what we see in the text that this is what this particular of davened. It doesn't mean that it's to the exclusion of the other prayers. It just means that we can derive from Avraham Avinu the davening of Shacharis. We can derive the tefillah of Mincha from what Yitzchak did, and we can derive the tefillah of Meirav from what Yaakov did. It doesn't mean that Yaakov didn't daven Shacharis and Mincha. It just means that we see that Yaakov davened Meirav. That's when they caught him davening. That's right. He says, "V'chein kosav b'sefer Yochsin, v'kosav od ulai kol echad mehem hayoter zariz kefi midaso chulei ayin sham." And then he quotes something from a sefer Yochsin, which is really what Rabbi Lau was alluding to when he quoted Rabbi Amiel. I think that's who he quoted, right? Over Shabbos, Rabbi Amiel. And he said in his drasha that it's not that Avram only davened Shacharis, but Avram's tefillah, Avram's midah was the Shachar. Avram's sort of his quintessential way that he lived his life was that the whole world is sunny and bright and happy. Everything's great. There is no darkness. Everything is exciting. Everything is new and exciting. And that's when you're supposed to daven Shacharis. That's what Shacharis represents. Yitzchak represents equanimity. Everything's just about average. Everything's okay, not too great, nothing exciting, nothing terrible, nothing great. But that's the time you daven Mincha. That's what Mincha represents. That's the midah of Yitzchak Avinu. And Yaakov represents the midah of darkness, of tsaros befalling an individual. And that's the Bikesh Yaakov Leishev B'Shalva, right? Kafetz alav rukzo shel Yosef. Right? So that's the tefillah of Meirav that represents the midah of Yaakov Avinu. So that's another way of explaining this Gemara. Of course, Avram Avinu wouldn't daven Mincha with a gartel yet. So of course he would. But the point is that, right, every tefillah that Avram davened, his midah was the midah of Shacharis. Yitzchak was the midah of Mincha, and Yaakov was the midah of Meirav. Tosfos Yeshanim in Maseches Yoma says a similar point. He says in source number 5, he says, V'im Tomar, Hamrina beperak tfilas hashachar, that Yitzchak tikein tfilas mincha. Shenem Rabbi Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. The Tosfos Yeshanim is going on a different point in the Gemara in Yoma, but it's on the same Amud. The Gemara over there says that Slosei Davram Mechim Shachri Koslei, that when Avram Avinu would daven Mincha, he davened Mincha when the eastern wall would start to go dark, which means when it would be past noon during the day. So the Tosfos Yeshanim says, what are you talking about, Avram daven Mincha? Who says Avram daven Mincha? Yitzchak Avinu was the institutor of Mincha, not Avram. And he says, Yesh Lomar, Da'achar shetikna Yitzchak haya omer gam Avraham, kach pirush Rabbeinu Tam. So he quotes from Rabbeinu Tam, who says that Avram Avinu daven Mincha, but only after his son Yitzchak instituted it. But then he says, Inami Omer Rebbe de Mikol Makom Haya Omer Avram Mitchilel Shelo Asa Klal L'Chol B'nei Beiso Ad Shetikna Yitzchak Da'afila Rib Tavshilin Kim Kedarinu L'Kamon. Another answer, he says, is like we saw before from the Tzlach, and that is that Avram, of course, davened Mincha, but he didn't make it an institution for his household. He only made Shacharis an institution for his household, but he himself used to daven Mincha and Meirav to himself. Go inside a room, close the door, and he himself davened Mincha and Meirav.
Question. I forgot when Rabbi Lau was speaking, but he said Sacharayim. The high point of the day is not minute before, not minute after. That'd be the high point, not the time of it. That's neither here nor there. That's the way you described it. His life was okay, was
balanced. That's the way I understood Rabbi Lau's statement, because Mincha, you have to realize, we don't daven Mincha at high noon. We daven Mincha in the afternoon.
He said there's only one point in the day, not a minute before, not a minute after, that he's referring to Yitzchak.
Yeah, so I have a problem with that, because the pasuk says Lifnos Arev, that Yitzchak went towards evening to begin davening Mincha. That's what I didn't really understand about what Rabbi Lau was saying. But I think the way I'm saying it is what he really meant to say. I hope I'm not taking too much license with what I think he was trying to point out is that when life is neither filled with excitement nor when it's filled with sorrows, that's the most difficult time to daven. It's the middle of the day, regular Tuesday afternoon. That's a good song, Tuesday afternoon. It's a regular Tuesday afternoon, right? And nothing exciting is happening. Just another visit to the water cooler, and I got to daven mincha. That's the hardest time to muster kavana and passion to the Ribbono Shel Olam. Okay? Shachris, of course. I got so much to look forward to. Got to ask the Ribbono Shel Olam for siyata d'shmaya. There's so much going on. And Ma'ariv, there's danger looming, crisis. Of course, it's the time to pray. But middle of the afternoon, Tuesday afternoon, is the time when. That's why Yitzchak is the Bachir Sheba Avos. He's the most important or the highest of all of the patriarchs, because he's able to commit himself fully to the Ribbono Shel Olam even at a time when nothing exciting is happening. Okay. I'm not sure whether we're going to have time to go into the Pnei Yehoshua, but I wanted to, at least we'll start the Pnei Yehoshua today, and if we don't get to it, we won't get to it. But at least we should at least see the question of the Pnei Yehoshua. Remember, I told you that Ma'ariv is, if Yaakov instituted Ma'ariv, then sort of he's getting short shrift. If Ma'ariv is a Tfilas Rishus, right? So the Gemara Itmar Reb Yossi Bar Chanina Amar Tfilas Avos Tiknon Reb Yeshua ben Levi Amar Chuli Lichora Nireh. He says it would seem at face value, Dahach Plugta Talya Beplugta de Tanoi Lekamon. It would seem that the machlokes between Reb Yeshua ben Levi and Reb Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina would be related to a machlokes that the Gemara discusses later on in our parak, Itfilas Arvis Rishus Al Chova, whether Ma'ariv is an obligatory prayer or an optional prayer. Demand the sphere le rishos al karchach savar tikeneged tmidim tikno umishumachit tfilas shachos min chachova mashenkin tfilas arvish sheina ela keneged ibarim with pedorim deloma akvi kapara. So he says as follows: if you hold that Ma'ariv is an optional prayer, it's because that when the sages instituted Ma'ariv, they instituted it to correspond not to a specific korban, which is required to atone for sins, but rather to correspond to the burning of the fats and the intestines that are burning at night on the Mizbeach. Now, if those fats and intestines would not burn, would the korban still have efficacy? Of course. And therefore it's not necessary. And therefore Ma'ariv is not necessary. That all makes very good sense. Va'od she'ikra mitzvasan la'aktirin biyom. U'mishum hachi havishakir rishos. And furthermore, the main mitzvah of burning the fats and intestines is still while it's daytime. So the fact that they continue burning into the night is only really ancillary to the daytime korbanos, and that's why Ma'ariv is only an optional prayer. Uman do'amar tfilos arvis chova, sober de tfilos avos tiknum. He says, if however you hold that Ma'ariv is a mandatory prayer, that's because you hold that Yaakov Avinu instituted it. Because according to that Reb Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina, all three prayers have equal standing, so why should there be a difference? Okay, and then he goes on. But what I want to point out from the Pnei Yehoshua is that as we've explained based on the Maraschias and based upon the very language of the Rambam itself, it becomes clear that there's really not a machlokes in the maskana of the Gemara between Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. And we've also demonstrated that from the Yerushalmi, that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi also holds that the Avos were involved in the eventual takana that the Anshe Knesses Hagdola made of instituting Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. It's really a combination of both, and that was instituted by the sages. So therefore, we have to figure out then that if Ma'ariv is a Rishus, are we not shortchanging Yaakov Avinu? Nebuch, Yaakov Avinu, was given short shrift because we couldn't find a korban to correspond to his tefillah. What are we going to do? So the Pnei Yehoshua comes up with a brilliant explanation later on, and I just want to show you this Pnei Yehoshua. It's on the bottom paragraph of page 2, and we're coming in the middle of a discussion of an analysis of Tosfos, which is not germane to our discussion right now. And he says as follows. He says, "Miu kol zeh kasaftu l'shitas haTosfos." What I've written up above, up until now, is relevant to explain Tosfos. However, omnam luli divreim hayanira li, but without looking at Tosfos, he says for a second, it would seem to me that Tfilas Yaakov ba'osos man lo haya b'da'ato l'kova Tfilas arvis. When Yaakov Avinu davened, and it says vayifga b'makom, that he got to that place in Beit El, which was really the Har HaBayis, as Rashi goes through, and it says Vayola and Sham Kiva Hashemesh, and he lodged there because the sun had set, and that's where Chazal say that he davened Ma'ariv. Yaakov Avinu's intention was never to institute Ma'ariv as an obligatory prayer. El Sharatza Lihispalel Derech Nidava. He dafka wanted Ma'ariv to be a voluntary offering, not an obligatory, not a sense of obligation. Why? He says, Kidamashma Lishna Dahasam. Because if you look carefully at the language of the Midrash and the way that Rashi cites it, he says, what did Yaakov say? Why did Yaakov daven? Why did Yaakov stop there to daven when he gets to the place of the Makam HaMikdash? He says, Efsher she'avarti al Makam shehispalalu avosai. How could I pass by a place where my ancestors davened and I don't stop and daven? Now that language itself implies that it's not that Yaakov Avinu felt obligated to daven and he didn't want to institute Ma'ariv as an obligatory prayer. But he says, my ancestors davened in this place. My heart inspires me to offer a prayer as homage to my Zaidi and to my father. That's the reason why he davened Ma'ariv. And if so, then the original prayer of Yaakov Avinu was essentially different from the prayer of Avraham when he gets up to daven in the morning for the people of Sodom, and when Yitzchak is davening because they're both davening for truly purposeful issues. Now think about this for a second. Avraham Avinu gets up to daven, he's davening for the people of Sodom. Yitzchak Avinu goes out to the field and he's davening. What is he davening for? Remember the story? Why is Yitzchak Avinu davening? Someone tell me. For a shidduch. He's davening because he knows that Rivka's on the way, and he's davening to the Ribono Shalom that it should be a good zivuk. But Yaakov Avinu is not davening for anything in particular other than,
he happens to the Makom.
I came to this place, how can I not stop and pay tributes to my father and my grandfather? So therefore says the Pnei Yoshua that even the very inception, the historical nature of Ma'ariv is also as a voluntary prayer. El la'achar shera Yaakov sheshakalo hachama shelo ba'onasa mishum hachi la'achar kach nikvas man tfilas arbes la'achar shkiyas hachama. He says, and that's why he says, the nearest shemizatam, kabbalah and tefillas arbis rishus. He says, and that's why we paskin, like the Man Domer who says that Ma'ariv is not a mandatory prayer, it's a voluntary prayer, even though nowadays the way that we paskin is that Ma'ariv is a mandatory prayer. He says, and even though the Torah gives a precedent for Yaakov davening, the nature of Yaakov's tefillah was also a tefillas nedava. So there's more to discuss here, but I want to just review what we've seen tonight. Number one, we've been able to establish that when Chazal present us with a machlokes between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi as to whether the davening was instituted by Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or whether it was instituted by the rabbis to correspond to Karbonos, the truth of the matter is that Lemaskanas HaGemara, everyone agrees that the davening was instituted by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah to daven 3 times a day. And everyone agrees that there is a historical precedent for davening thrice daily, but that when the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah instituted this prayer, they instituted it to correspond to the constraints of the offering of the Karbanos in the Beis HaMikdash. So that we've seen very clearly that really, Elu Velu Divrei Elokim Chaim, there's really no machlokes, and that's really, according to the Maharschias, implicit in the Maskanas HaGemara. We've also seen that you can't base a halachic practice on what Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov did, and it certainly is true that the obligation to daven Shachris, Mincha, and Ma'ariv is rabbinic in nature and not biblical in nature. You should know that in general there's a machlokes rishonim whether the obligation for prayer on a regular basis when there's no trouble in your life is a biblical obligation or not. The Rambam holds that it is a biblical obligation. The Ramban says that it is non-biblical, it's rabbinic. But even the Rambam, who holds that there's a biblical obligation, only holds that it's once daily. It does not hold that there's a biblical obligation for davening Shachris Mincha Ma'ariv. So no one really holds that you can learn from Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov a biblical obligation. We also saw then it would stand to reason that when we say that Avram davened Shachris, it's not to the exclusion of the fact that he didn't daven Mincha and Ma'ariv, but that he davened Mincha and Ma'ariv, but not as an obligatory prayer that he would pass on to his household, that he wanted to sort of model for future generations. But his attribute was Shachris, Yitzchak's attribute was Mincha, and Yaakov's attribute was Ma'ariv. Okay, any questions, comments? Okay, we'll daven Ma'ariv.